the 29th of October, 1929, after 4 days of frenzied trading, the New York stock market on Wall Street crashed, wiping $10 billion from the nation's economy. It was the greatest financial catastrophe the modern world had ever seen. Thousands of American citizens lost everything they had as the value of their shares plummeted. The market had been rising for months, so news of the crash stunned the country. With very few exceptions, no one had seen it coming. Throughout 1929, everyone thought they could make a fortune buying and selling shares. And since the banks were only too happy to offer loans, most of them were bought on almost unlimited credit. The mad scramble for shares was a blunder which would lead to mass unemployment in the U.S., a worldwide depression which was to last throughout the 1930s and partly act as a trigger for World War II. The U.S. government, which might have prevented the crash, or at least lessened its impact, also exacerbated the blunder by failing to respond in a decisive manner. Yet all the signs had been there. 10 days before the crash, it was reported from Washington that there were problems finding the money to run the $2.5 million luxury yacht Corsair just presented to the government by the financier and banker J.P. Morgan, Jr. It did not seem that significant at the time, but it was a grim omen of the chaos which was to follow during the last few days of October. Earlier warnings about a downturn had been largely ignored. The panic started on Thursday, October 24th, as people began selling shares with the same fervor with which they'd bought them. There was a brief rally the next day. That weekend, the market fell again. The following Tuesday, October 29th, there was more frantic selling. A staggering 16.5 million shares flooded the stock exchange floor. But there were no buyers, and the market completely collapsed. For many of those who worked on Wall Street, the pressure and shame brought about by the crash was unbearable. As the dramatic events unfolded at the New York Stock Exchange during the last week of October, it did not take long for news to reach the general public. A large crowd started gathering outside on Wall Street. When their demands for information grew more strident, Grover Whalen, New York's Commissioner of Police, ordered in a special detail to ensure that peace was maintained. In the black days which lay ahead, countless numbers of people lost not only their jobs, but also their homes and savings. Many of the once proud and wealthy now stared poverty in the face. Desperation was in the air, and even the most menial of jobs attracted hundreds of applicants. Misery and a feeling of utter hopelessness spread across the entire nation. By the end of the year, the United States had sunk into a deep recession. An incredible $40 billion had been lost to the economy. Hundreds of banks and businesses were forced to close as the country ground to a virtual standstill. The recession developed into a full-blown depression, and the gloom quickly spread to Western Europe. Britain suffered great hardship as unemployment rose to 3 million. People struggled to barely survive above subsistence level, selling whatever they could just to make ends meet. The situation was even more grim in Germany. Following its defeat in World War I, the country was already heavily burdened with reparation payments to the victorious Allies. There were restrictions on foreign trade, and the government was bankrupt. The poverty-stricken people scratched a living as best they could. Conditions were truly dreadful, and unemployment soared to 6 million, 25% of the workforce. Food riots broke out all over Germany. Extremist groups were quick to exploit the chaos. Prominent among them was the National Socialist Party, already dominated by Adolf Hitler. In September 1939, Hitler plunged Europe and then the entire world into a terrible war. This was the ultimate appalling legacy of the Blunders on Wall Street. Throughout the 1920s, America's economy boomed. The country had become the greatest industrial power in the world, and share prices rose accordingly. Nearly everyone thought the bull market would last forever. Thousands of small investors bought shares on credit, confident that they would always be profitable. And at the time, they were right. The reason they were making a profit was because more and more people wanted to buy shares. This constant demand drove prices to ever-dizzying heights. Few seemed to realize that if the number of new buyers waned, the market would slide and the bubble would eventually burst. But as long as the market kept rising, no one seemed to care. Investors were desperate for stock at any price, and millions of dollars flowed through to America's bankers and industrialists. It was the greatest transfer of wealth the world had ever seen. This was the Roaring '20s. America was on a roll, and everyone was determined to have a good time. Lively young flappers showed off their skills with the Charleston dance craze. Nightclubs were packed, and the streets jammed with expensive new automobiles. There seemed to be plenty of time to relax. Either on the beach or at the races. Any excuse was used for a parade. Sporting heroes were honored. Like boxer Jack Dempsey and the Yankees baseball team. Or Charles Lindbergh, who was the first aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927. At the same time, American industry was so efficient that it was actually producing more than the home market could consume. Assembly line techniques, especially in the automobile factories, had increased output enormously. Warehouses overflowed with surplus stock, but because of an earlier misjudgment by Congress, none of the excess could be sold overseas. Congress, under pressure from the business community, had imposed strict import tariffs to discourage Americans from buying foreign goods. The country's export markets then retaliated by refusing to deal with the U.S. As demand fell, factories all over the United States started laying off production staff. Industry slowed down and unemployment began to rise. Yet the banks still recklessly lent money to practically anyone who asked. They made vast profits by charging high interest rates, trying to maintain the boom for as long as possible. Such short-term thinking by industry and the banks was a recipe for disaster. Calvin Coolidge, the Republican president from 1923 to 1929, the years of apparent prosperity, seemed unaware of what was happening. During his term of office, he had leaned over backwards to help big business, restricting imports and rejecting calls for anti-monopoly legislation. Meanwhile, Coolidge ignored pleas from farmers for guaranteed grain prices. Agriculture was already in recession and had been so more or less since the end of World War I. The farming community was desperate for some kind of stability. Instead, they were burdened with static or falling prices and ever-rising costs. They couldn't afford to replace machinery, and they knew much of their harvest would be sold at a loss. And as many were already deep in debt to the banks, their prospects were dire. Coolidge, who by now was called Coolidge the Inert, was oblivious, declaring that America was a business country which wanted a business government. By 1929, he had had enough of high office and declared he would not run again. He was succeeded in February by Herbert Hoover, the former Secretary of Commerce. As a member of the previous administration, Hoover had played a decisive role in helping promote the 1920s boom. He was a strong advocate of non-intervention, believing that America's industrialists and bankers did not need to be told how to conduct their affairs. The aftermath of the Wall Street crash did little to alter Hoover's views. He seemed indifferent to the misery of those caught up in the maelstrom. Instead, as the lines of unemployed lengthened, he called for what he described as rugged individualism, saying that people should look after themselves rather than relying on the state. But America was in economic and social turmoil. Without any state aid, the only way for thousands of people to eat was at soup kitchens set up by various charities. Many gave up the search for work, spending their days slumped in the streets and foraging in trash cans for anything they could sell or eat. The government may not have cared, but the notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone appeared so distressed by what was going on that he spent $2,500 a week of his ill-gotten gains in helping feed the hungry and homeless. Those in the ever-expanding food lines didn't care who was funding the handouts. All they wanted was something to eat. Shantytowns quickly sprouted on the outskirts of most big cities. They became known as Hoovervilles, named after the president who seemed so indifferent to the tragedy which was engulfing America. It was not until 1931 that Hoover belatedly realized that he should do something. He embarked on a drastic reduction in public works spending. This ill-conceived cutback resulted in even more people being thrown on the scrap heap. Unemployment in the United States reached almost 14 million. The nation was paralyzed, and no one seemed to care, least of all Hoover. In June 1932, thousands of ex-servicemen descended on Washington. They were staging a mass protest against the delay in paying them long-promised bonuses for fighting in World War I. Police tried to keep order as tempers began to flare. Hoover grew alarmed at the spreading violence, during which 2 of the veterans died. General Douglas MacArthur, the recently appointed U.S. Army Chief of Staff, was ordered to use troops to break up the protest. He drafted in 4 cavalry units and 4 companies of infantry to do the job. The military moved in and destroyed an encampment area which the veterans had set up on the edge of the city. By now, the weary protesters had had enough, and they quickly dispersed. Their unhappiness reflected the despair felt across the whole of America. It was against this backdrop in November 1932 that Hoover ran again for the presidency. He was overwhelmingly defeated by Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, who swept into the White House with 23 million votes, compared to Hoover's 15 million. Roosevelt came to office promising Americans a New Deal. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Manufacturing was still in the doldrums and unemployment was sky high. He had a novel approach. With his mother and wife sitting loyally at his side, Roosevelt regularly addressed the nation through what became known as fireside chats. He used them to outline his plans for recovery. He was an inspired speaker.
Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
During his first 10 days in office, Roosevelt set up a series of government agencies aimed at turning things around. Deep cuts were made into the ranks of the unemployed as 4 million people were put to work on public projects under the backing of the Civil Conservation Corps. Richard Whitney, president of the New York Stock Exchange, began to see a return to financial normality.
Confidence is bound to return, and when it does, prices will rise. I feel that the basic causes of the Depression have been intelligently studied, and that in all quarters of the world, responsible people are working towards constructive ends. I have no doubt of their ultimate success, and I have supreme confidence in the future of our own country and its great business and industrial organizations.
Roosevelt's administration introduced many far-reaching financial reforms. These included creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed bank deposits, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, which would closely monitor all future activity on the New York Stock Exchange. Roosevelt was determined there would never be another Wall Street crash. A radical Social Security Act gave workers unemployment pay for the first time, and Roosevelt encouraged reluctant private sector companies to pay fair wages and recognize trade unions. America's hard-pressed farmers were not forgotten. They were encouraged to cut production by being paid generous subsidies. This enabled them to raise prices after years of hardship. Another major innovation was the National Recovery Act. It was aimed at everyone and headed by General Hugh Johnson. Putting America back on its feet again after the long-term effects of the Wall Street crash was costing billions of dollars, all of which was raised through taxation. As more and more people went back to work, a new mood of confidence returned. The food lines had disappeared, and people felt they had a future once more. By 1935, Roosevelt was convinced that his comprehensive and radical economic and industrial policies were finally beginning to work. But for all his good intentions, Roosevelt's reforms were making him enemies. Many of the country's leading industrialists yearned for a return to the non-interventionist policies of the previous Hoover administration. One of Roosevelt's most bitter critics was Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturer. Ford totally despised Roosevelt and reviled him at every opportunity. However, after being persuaded by his son, Ford relented enough to greet Roosevelt on a visit to one of his factories, which had been given over to the manufacturer of military equipment. Such equipment was soon to be needed by America's allies in Europe, which was about to be engulfed by World War II. Europe had followed the lead set by the U.S. and hauled itself out of economic depression. Towards the end of the 1930s, industrial output rose, agriculture began to recover, and unemployment fell rapidly. But by now, the world was marching inevitably towards total war. Hitler, who had been Chancellor of Germany since September 1933, had swept into power, promising to restore the country's pride through strong and determined leadership. Even though the world readied itself for yet another devastating conflict, the Great Depression of the 1930s seemed over at last. However, it was not until the 1950s that the U.S. stock market and the economy had fully recovered from the catastrophic effects of the 1929 crash, which had been caused by the recklessness and greed of the American banking community, chronic industrial overproduction, a headlong dash by the public to buy shares at any price, and political indifference. America's stock market and other financial institutions are now strictly regulated, but this doesn't mean to say that such a blunder couldn't occur again. Maybe not on the same ruinous scale, but so long as people want to make money from buying and selling shares, the risk is always there.